I'm going to move us into Sharim, and it is, I didn't mean to do this, but it is a very fluent and fluid welcoming to Sharim to end that last sentence on communion. Sharim has been a communal learner, teacher, guide, unlearner, and model of what it means to be in constant process and progress. And I have been grateful to be alongside Sharim's journey for so many years. Sharim, I'm going to welcome you to join me in Spotlight. And I'm going to invite a colleague to drop Sharim's bio in the chat so that you can learn more about Dr. Hannegan-Martinez. Sharim, thank you for being here. Thank you for presencing yourself. And most importantly, thank you for bringing all who you have been in communion with and your teachings of your relationship with isolation and community together. I already know that the students who you have loved and the students you love and the students who you will love are in the room. So thank you.
Ooh. Perfect. Thank you for that introduction and invitation. You made me want to cry at the beginning. Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes, buenos días for some of you on the West Coast. Again, my name is Sharim Hannegan-Martinez, and I am a former high school English teacher and ethnic studies teacher, and I'm now a professor at the University of Michigan. And I want to share with you all some of the work that I've been engaging in over the last 15 years and arguably longer, before I was even born, around how I experience and create collective care and renewal within my school community, and how that really starts with self. So I think it's a perfect transition from what I heard you all were talking about yesterday. And so a lot of how I enter this conversation is really starting with trauma. And what we know about trauma is that it is one of the greatest socio inequities facing children, and particularly children of color in this country. That the numbers tell us that more than 2/3 of children have experienced what they consider a traumatic stressor or event. That 35% of them have experienced more than one. And that this data alone warrants what we now understand is a public health crisis. Right? Because unmetabolized trauma, prolonged exposure to trauma has long-term dire physical, emotional, socio-emotional, and spiritual effects and consequences in the lives of children and all of our lives. And while this data is already truly grotesque and alarming, the reality is that most of it is also dated before a global pandemic, before we have been forced to bear witness to the genocide of Palestinian people, before national uprisings resisting racism and anti-Blackness and the state-sanctioned murder of Black people in this country. And so the data is actually much more alarming than this. And in response to this public health crisis, there has been a sort of growth of trauma-informed research. And I know you heard from Alex yesterday, right? So there are folks who are really stewarding this conversation in really, I think, important ways. But the reality is that the field at large is actually still talking about trauma in really dangerous ways, in ways that are color evasive, in ways that don't acknowledge the lived realities of children, that don't acknowledge oppression as a form of trauma. And a lot of the sort of trauma-informed practices and social emotional learning has actually focused it on subduing children's righteous behavioral responses to trauma. Right? So rather than helping young people to heal or address trauma in their own lives, a lot of the practices have really focused on like, how do we actually just make you more compliant to your suffering so that we can get through the school day easier? More recently, we have also had an uptake in grief research, right? And this research is also really important, particularly given the context of the global pandemic and ongoing genocides. However, these phenomena have been studied almost entirely as separate in the field of education. And very little research has been done to think about how grief is a trauma-informed practice. Right? When we know, as Francis Weller tells us, that trauma always carries grief, but that grief work is a primary ingredient in the resolution of trauma. And so I want to spend some time today thinking about really the role of grief, how we use it, how we feel it, but also how grief is a practice of building and sustaining loving community in our schools, our classrooms, and in our lives. And so you might think, like, why grief? And I'll get to that in a second. But one of the other things that really, I think, thwarts our efforts in trauma-informed practices is what Antero Garcia refers to as a healing gap. And the healing gap essentially says that schools are often asking teachers to do all of this healing work with children, right? You need to be trauma-informed, you need to be healing-centered, you need to engage in social emotional learning, you need to support the well-being of children, and yet teachers are not supported to do that in their own lives. And so you're asking teachers to do something that they're often untrained, unsupported, or ill-equipped to do. Because how do we teach young people to do something that we literally don't know how to do for ourselves? And this healing practice is something that I know well, right? For the last 15 years, I told you all, I have been engaging in research on trauma and healing and love in and outside of the high school classroom, in the academy. And yet in 2020, when the pandemic hit, and I was in some of the worst throes of grief that I've ever experienced, and I was really sort of struggling with how to make sense of everything, as you all know, because we were there, right? As I was struggling to make sense of all of this, I was in therapy and I was asking my therapist, like, how am I going to support students, right? The semester is about to start. I'm about to be in my first year as a professor. Like, how do I create this container for the students I'm about to teach? And she asked me this question that has changed not just the trajectory of my work and my career, but really what I think it means to build loving community with children and with students. And she asked me, why are you so committed to centering the grief and healing of your students when you so often try to avoid your own? And this question led me on this journey to being what Steph Cariaga and others call in right relationship to my grief. And so again, why grief, right? Why this as the entry point? Well, one, right, we know that grief is necessary for healing from trauma and that the numbers for trauma are alarming. But when we look at the data on grief, we also know that when we look at the global pandemic in 2020, 1 million people, so much more than that now, right, passed away, that 140,000 children were left bereaved, and that 65% of those were children of color. Right. So again, grief as something that is also not race evasive, right? That is highly political and experienced within the context and confines of the structures in which this country is set up. Right. As of a few days ago, almost 40,000 Palestinians had been martyred. Again, we know that this data is underreported and that this was a few days ago. So this number is high now. And so there's this urgency for us to really think about how do we support young people in their grieving, support teachers in their grieving, and how do we do that if we are unwilling to feel our own grief? When you look at other folks, though, they push us to think about grief as beyond, right, simply the loss of life, and really think about grief as the structural, emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual change that occurs as a direct result of experiencing loss, right? And Weller tells us that there are 5 ways that we might experience loss, that it can be everything we love that we will lose, that it can be the places that have not known love, our ancestral grief, our intergenerational grief, collective and global grief, right? And I would argue that there is also this anticipatory grief in this country that we experience when we live in bodies that we know are not considered worthy of life, right? That we are always anticipating the grief that is coming. And so that also leads us to understand that schools exist as sites of grief too, right? To be successful in this country requires losing parts of yourself, right? Your language, your culture, your home practices, and that is still, right, again, added to the layer of, as Lior was talking about, that these schools also exist on indigenous, stolen, ancestral land. And so we have to understand that oftentimes when we talk about grief and trauma, we talk about it as something that children are bringing to schools, as opposed to something that schools are also doing to children. And grief becomes problematic, right, when we don't have the conditions to help us heal, when we don't have the right? So grief in itself is not a bad thing, right? Grief is a gift, actually, right? But grief becomes heavy and burdensome when we don't have the conditions to help us heal through it, and can lead to things like depression, anxiety, anger, illness, and again, all of these sort of physiological responses that align with the long-term impacts of trauma as well. So there's an urgency for us to understand how we might use and be in different relationship to grief. And so I want to share with you all what that has looked like for me in my own practice and in my own life. And I'm going to share with you all a testimonial on my journey through grief. And I want to be very clear. I'm not going to go into a lot of methods and right, but I want to be very clear that testimonial, most folks hear it and they think testimony, right? That it's a story I'm going to share with you all. And it's very much a story, but testimonials are explicitly political in that they center what we consider the subaltern, right? That they situate the body as a site of wisdom and disrupt mind-body splits. And I would argue that in the context of schooling in this country, to center grief, to center emotionality is a very political choice to push back on the way that we have been doing things. Right. So a story, very much so, but a story with very political intentions, that there is a need for us to transform the ways in which we are moving through educational spaces. And so for me, this story starts really in March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic. And I want to be clear that I'm sharing this testimonial with you all. And it is one of the hardest things that I've ever written and or shared. That despite growing up in a border town on the San Diego-Tijuana border, being Mexican and coming from a culture where we have rituals for engaging and honoring grief, that I still found myself turning away from this, that I still felt this fear that if I leaned in, that it would consume me fully. And that I choose to do so because I think that part of addressing the healing gap in my own life and supporting others to do the same is explicit modeling of how we do that. And that requires a certain level of vulnerability. And so the story starts for me at the beginning of March when I signed my first contract for a university position. So I was wrapping up my dissertation. I was starting, transitioning to starting my job as a professor. And so it starts off in March 1st when I'm signing my contract for my position. I'm very excited about this. And it came with a lot of grief as well, because I was moving away from my home state to a very small state with very few folks of color, far away from everybody that I knew and loved. And I experienced all of this sort of anticipatory grief and grief at leaving behind what I knew in order to go to a place where I felt like I could do meaningful work. And so you see, right, I'm here, I'm signing in very, I would argue, culturally responsive and congruent ways, right? Ways that align to my own family sensibilities. I even printed it out, which you all know you don't have to do that anymore. You could sign everything online, but it just felt anticlimactic. So I printed it out, right? I'm excited. I made a whole thing of it. And as soon as I sign, I'm like, well, now I have to actually finish my dissertation. And so my dissertation was focusing on love, and specifically how students that I had worked with for 4 years and I were conceptualizing love and how we embodied it in the context of our English classroom over the 4 years that we spent together. And so I was really focusing on love because part of what the trauma research tells us also is that love is one of the number one protective barriers to the long-term impacts of trauma. That the more loving relationships we have, the more likely we are to recover and the more likely we are to thrive. And so I was really interested in, what does that mean then? What does that look like? How do students know that they are loved? And so I went to this group of young people that I had taught for 4 years, right? We had a 97% graduation rate at a school where the push-out rate was above 40% every year. And I was really interested in exploring with them after 4 years together, how did we do this? And so we came up with this definition of love that I want you to hold on to, right? Which is that love is a political praxis, intention, action, and reflection of cultivating interdependence for the purpose of our individual and collective survival, sustainability, well-being, wholeness, and joy. Right? So again, political. To love what this country would otherwise kill is a political choice, right? That requires intention, action, and reflection for our interdependence. And that it was practiced across 4 realms: intellectually, spiritually, tangibly, and emotionally, with self, peers, community, and the world. That it was made up of things like safety and honesty, vulnerability, care, commitment, and that together those things made love. And we begin and end with love, really honoring a letter that James Baldwin wrote to his nephew, where he talks about how we have survived because you are loved, and now you must survive for your children and your children's children. And so we begin and end with love as the impetus, the process, and the outcome, that it has to be what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. And so I was sitting at home, right? Signed my contract, finishing up my dissertation, working on these beautiful findings and learnings that I was privileged enough to gather alongside the children that I taught, when all of a sudden, days later, right, we're put on a stay-at-home order and the pandemic has sort of hit full force. And all of a sudden, I have no idea what is happening in my life and everybody's life, right? And everywhere that I go, right, the streets are ransacked. The lines outside Target are wild, right? Don't even get me started on Trader Joe's, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm like, what is happening? I'm trying to focus. And there's a part of me that's still like, let's give it a few weeks. There's no way this is going to last. And so I'm sitting there, and then a few days pass, and then a few weeks pass, right? And I'm sitting, I live alone, and I'm sitting, oh, wow, like we might be stuck here for a little bit. And a month into that, as I'm starting to feel restless, which I'm sure you all resonate with, I'm starting to feel restless, I'm starting to feel panicked, I'm starting to feel grief. I get the news that one of my former students, Gabby, had died. And the day I get the news, the morning that I get the news that Gabby died, I literally immediately just put on running shoes and I run my fastest mile ever, like a sub-8, have never done it again, run so fast and collapse crying in a cul-de-sac. And it was the first time that I think I realized just how alone I was and just how lonely I was and how unprepared I was to grieve by myself in those types of conditions. And so I sat on this cul-de-sac crying for hours until I gathered the sort of courage to walk back and keep going. Right. And I even wrote in my sort of journal, and I'm not sharing this with you all because I'm poetic by any means, right? But because I think that it's important to, the rawness of it is important, right? That I was writing and I was like, the world is on fire or colliding or crashing, whatever you want to call it, and I'm alone. And there is no pretty word for that. And so I'm grieving not just her death, right? But the community I feel like somehow I think everybody else has that I don't, as I'm sitting there alone in my apartment. And then we move forward another month, right? And we experience, again, having to witness the state-sanctioned murder of Black people in this country. And we see national uprisings after George Floyd is murdered, right? And all over the country, we're seeing people's grief on display, right? Because let us be very clear that organizing is a practice of healing and it is a practice of grieving, right? Grieving what we've lost, what we should have had, what we desire. And so we're witnessing all of this grief on display nationally. And where I am, right, there are helicopters 24 hours a day. And not a day later, the US hits 100,000 death toll for the first time. And I am inconsolable because the grief feels like it's too much. My individual grief, our ancestral grief, our collective grief, our global grief, and it's all just layered and layered and layered. And I feel like I don't know what I'm supposed to do or how I'm supposed to handle it. I push through, and I'm moving a little bit faster through this, right? And then on June 6th, I get the news that my former student, Eric Salgado, had been murdered by the Oakland Police Department. That they had shot 40 bullets at him and his pregnant girlfriend. He did not survive. The baby did not survive. She did. And Eric is Gabby's cousin, right? And so all of a sudden, I'm on the phone and I'm holding students as best I can from far away. I'm doing everything that I can, but they are inaudible behind the wails of loss, but so am I. And the night that he dies, that he's murdered, I sit on my floor on FaceTime with some folks who I think are on this call right now, right? And folks are sending me food and force feeding me on live. Like, we need to watch you eat. Because all I could do was cry and drink tequila because I reverted to the sort of dirty pain and wounded healing that had been modeled to me by so many people in my own life. And so I lean into, right, what Menachem refers to as this dirty pain. And I end up tweeting this thing about how teachers need to care about our students who are being killed and they need to be saying something about police brutality. And I start getting death threats on Twitter that tell me that he deserved to die. And so I say that to say that grief is political, that who is allowed to grieve, what we consider grievable, who is considered grievable, are deeply, deeply political. And so again, I was engaging in this dirty pain, right? This pain when people respond from their most wounded parts, when they become cruel or violent because they're running away because they don't have the conditions to support them. And so I was engaging in this dirty pain, and folks in my community were rallying, and my therapist, and right. And so I pulled back and I went back to creating an ofrenda, to organizing, right? To doing these things that I know are sacred for honoring people's lives, for honoring our own lives and the love that we have for them. And then a few days later, because I told you I was supposed to be finishing this dissertation, I graduate. And I also missed my graduation because COVID. And so my community came through, right, with posters, and they sat outside, and I put on my cap and gown, and I have this photo, and my eyes are closed because I'm crying so hard I cannot. There are no photos of me that exist this day with my eyes open. And, but again, the power of community, right? That I'm barely making it through, but I'm making it through. And I'm making it through because I'm being fed, because I'm being nourished, because I'm being loved on by people who would not let the grief consume me, including my former students. And that day, my student Sergio, one of the folks who taught me so much about love, who helped me come up with that definition of love, texted me and he said, "Congrats, Thea, you should be celebrating. Don't cry. Keep your head up." And not a week after he sends me this messages that help me stay afloat, Sergio was murdered. And I'm weeks away from starting my semester as a professor. And I don't know how I'm going to support students when I don't want to get out of bed. And so I really start thinking about the classroom that I want to create for my students. And I double down on leaning into what Menachem refers to as clean pain. So I sit down and I get clear with myself about my grief and I name it, all of it. And I stop trying to fight my emotions and I let myself feel all of them, the rage, right? The sadness, the longing. I make space for my body, right? I build more ofrendas, engage in rituals. I talk to my new ancestors. I let community hold me when I'm not strong enough to hold myself. And I want to be clear that these practices didn't take the pain away, but they made enough space in my body for me to be able to hold it. And that was what I needed from them. And so when I went into starting the semester and when I started looking at all of these practices, so many of which are intergenerational and ancestral and communal, I realized that they brought me back to love. And so for that semester that I taught, I took these practices and I applied them. I shared them, right? They became the cornerstones of our time together. What that meant was that as a class, we named grief. Right? We named, like we were grieving being in person, right? But naming our grief also allowed us to say like, wow, I'm grieving being in person, but I'm loving being in my sweatpants, right? I'm loving, I'm hating being online, but I'm loving not having my body policed. And so naming grief actually allowed us to imagine new ways of being, right? That when we were able to name it, right? Huey P talks about power is the ability to define phenomenon. Right? When we were able to name it, we regained a sort of agentic power in imagining new ways of doing and being when it comes to the context of schooling. And so we created book clubs. We talked about grief, right? Tangibly, we set up ofrendas in our own houses. I continue this practice every semester. We create altars and ofrendas in our classes, right? We nourished our body. We broke bread together, cooked together as part of teaching, right? Made sure that we were standing and moving and that movement was intentional, that it was a way of returning to, right? We designed and wore clothing that honored our ancestors. Again, you see this practice all the time, right? Emotionally, we talked about feelings. We came up with new ways to name feelings. We went through like the 1,000 synonyms for, right? And to figure out what are our feelings teaching us about what we need. And lastly, we made space for talking about our ancestors, for writing to them, talking about them, bringing their lessons and learnings into our classroom. These all sort of overlap with how we not just honored grief, but created a loving community, right? Because what students told me at the end of that semester was, you didn't just make a space for grief, but by allowing me to show up in my grief, by supporting me through it, by creating a container for it, you also showed me that you loved me. You also created an opportunity for me to love on myself, to love on my ancestors in new ways, to love on my peers in new ways. And so at the last minute that I have left, I want to offer some questions for you, right? To support you in building the type of loving community that centers grief, that is strong enough to hold it, and therefore strong enough to create more deeper, loving relationships. And some of those are, what are you grieving? What losses have you yet to grieve? What might your students or teachers be grieving? What scares you the most about grief? Right? What practices can you draw on to connect to it? How might those also be practices of love? Right? What resources do you have? And I know that the next session is on resourcing. Right? What is one thing you can do to make space for grief today? Again, as a practice of love, as a practice of loving yourself, as a practice of loving your ancestors, and as a practice of loving your students enough to do the work so that you can show them what it looks like and what it feels like. And what is a commitment that you can make to loving yourself, to loving your community in this way? Because ultimately, right, grief is an inevitable outcome of loving. I know that that's how we talk about it, and it's true. Grief is very much an inevitable outcome of loving. But I would argue that it's also a practice for creating and sustaining the type of loving community we know is necessary for our healing and for our overall well-being. So, thank you all.
Take one moment to give us like a real power. That was so powerful. Take one moment, bring your slides back up just to show the journal that you and Dr. Cariaga curated that we got to
Oh,
write
yes.
resource, and also to give people ways to connect with you. Give yourself the moment.
Yes.
Share
Thank
and then I'll share.
yeah, thank you all for allowing me to share, again, not just as a practice of storytelling and vulnerability, but really, I think, modeling what it might look like for us to close the healing gap in our own practice and our own lives, so that we can model for students and for teachers what it looks and feels like to do this work. And so I, again, have been working on this for a while with one of my colleagues, Stephanie Cariaga. We put out a special issue this year called Grief as an Invitation to Heal, Extending Trauma-Informed Pedagogy's Research and Practice. It includes the voices of teachers and scholars, practitioners, administrators, all women of color primarily. And Leora's in it. There are other folks that are on the call that are on it. And so I invite you all to check it out. The cover art is by one of my students. And I think really illustrates the nuanced ways in which we are hoping to lean into honor how sacred of a practice we think grief is, and how necessary we think it is for healing, for renewal, and for showing up as our full selves. So we invite you to please check it out and contact us or whatever.